All right. So you want to learn more about Christopher Columbus?
Go a little deeper than the discovered America narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack some really fascinating details about his life.
And his voyages.
And this isn't just about dates and places.
Right.
It's going to be about the motivations
And the complexities.
that make his story so intriguing.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that even before we get to the voyages,
Mm-hmm.
there's a mystery surrounding his origins.
That's right.
Many people believe that he was from Genoa, Italy.
Uh-huh.
But some sources actually suggest that he might have been from the Iberian Peninsula.
Yeah.
So it's almost like his story starts with a question mark.
Mm.
You know, imagine a figure so central to history,
Right.
and yet his birthplace is still debated.
Yeah. I mean, it speaks to the fact that even with historical figures as prominent as Columbus,
Right.
there are still gaps in our knowledge.
Yeah.
And these gaps often lead to
Yeah.
intriguing theories and interpretations.
Okay, so let's unpack his early life. He was a textile worker's son, which suggests a pretty humble beginning.
Right.
But then we hear about him navigating the Ligurian coast.
Uh-huh.
And there's even some speculation about potential involvement in piracy.
Yeah, so that's a theory that definitely adds a layer of adventure and intrigue to his early years.
Right, and whether or not he was actually involved in piracy,
Uh-huh.
it's likely that he was exposed to the world of seafaring and trade
Absolutely.
during this time.
That would have been invaluable later on.
Yeah, and then there's his marriage to Filippo Moniz de Perestrello, which wasn't just a love story, you know?
Right.
It actually connected him to families who were deeply involved in Atlantic exploration.
Exactly. This marriage placed him within a network
Yeah.
of experienced navigators, map makers, and individuals with knowledge of the Atlantic.
Wow.
It's no coincidence that his ambitions for exploration grew during this period.
So after years at sea, Columbus develops this radical idea, sailing west to reach Asia. Now, in the 15th century, this was a pretty bold concept.
Oh, absolutely. At the time, most people believed the Earth was much smaller than it actually is.
Right.
And the idea of sailing west across an unknown ocean was considered incredibly risky.
It's fascinating, though, how a scholar named Paolo del Pozzo Toscanelli actually reinforced Columbus's belief. Now, Toscanelli corresponded with Columbus, and he believed in a shorter distance to Asia than was actually the case.
Yeah, and his miscalculations were based on commonly held beliefs at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Many underestimated the Earth's circumference,
Right.
and Toscanelli also believed in the existence of intermediary islands
Interesting.
between Europe and Asia,
Okay.
making that westward journey seem less daunting.
It's incredible how these miscalculations really fueled Columbus's determination.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if he would have even been as persistent if he knew the true distance.
Right.
And he really clung to this idea of intermediary islands as a crucial part of his plan.
He saw them as essential rest stops, places to replenish supplies during the long voyage. This shows us that he wasn't simply blindly sailing west.
Right.
There was strategic thinking
Yeah.
behind his plan.
Of course, to undertake such an ambitious journey, he needed funding.
Yeah.
So his first stop was King John II of Portugal.
However, Portugal was already heavily invested in exploring routes around Africa to reach Asia. They weren't particularly interested in Columbus's westward proposal.
It's interesting that even after this rejection, Columbus didn't give up.
Yeah.
What do you think drove his determination?
Well, there's no doubt that he was ambitious and driven,
Right.
and he truly believed in his idea, and perhaps this conviction fueled his persistence.
Okay, so he sets his sights on Castile.
He does.
And this is where things get politically interesting.
Okay.
Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs of Castile, they were engaged in wars and were wary of conflict with Portugal over territorial claims.
Yeah.
So they weren't exactly eager to jump on board with Columbus's plan right away.
It was a time of shifting alliances and power struggles in Europe.
Yeah.
And Columbus's proposal was ultimately a political gamble for Ferdinand and Isabella.
They delayed a decision for years.
Yeah.
You have to imagine how frustrating this must have been for Columbus.
Absolutely.
Years of negotiations, setbacks.
Yeah.
Did he ever think about giving up?
Well, there's a fascinating story about Fray Juan Perez,
Okay.
a monk who was a staunch supporter of Columbus.
Okay.
He helped secure a crucial meeting with Queen Isabella.
Wow.
It was a turning point.
Oh, wow.
without Perez's intervention.
Right.
Columbus's proposal might have languished indefinitely.
So it seems luck played a part as well.
Absolutely.
But finally, in 1492,
yeah.
the capitulations of Santa Fe are signed. And this agreement outlined Columbus's titles.
Okay.
Admiral, Viceroy, Governor, and of course a share of any riches he found.
This wasn't just about exploration for Columbus.
Right.
He was seeking power and wealth.
Yeah.
And he wasn't shy about demanding significant rewards.
Some might say his demands were excessive. What do you think?
His demands certainly reflect the risks he was taking
Yeah.
and the potential rewards he envisioned.
Yeah.
He was a skilled negotiator
Yeah.
and understood the importance of securing his position and future wealth.
Okay, with the agreement in place,
Yeah.
Columbus set about assembling his crew and preparing for this journey. And this is where the power of the crown really comes into play.
Okay.
A royal decree was issued demanding that the people of Palos de la Frontera provide ships and resources for the expedition.
This highlights the extent of royal support behind Columbus's endeavor.
Wow.
It wasn't just about funding.
Yeah.
He had the full backing of the monarchy.
And let's debunk a common myth right here. Isabella didn't actually pawn her jewels to finance the voyage.
Right. While the crown provided financial support, a significant portion of the funding came from Luisa Santangel, prominent figure, and the Satana Hermandad, a powerful law enforcement organization.
It's interesting how there were so many key players involved in making this voyage a reality. And of course, we can't forget the three iconic ships.
Right.
The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria.
Yeah. Have you ever considered the crucial role each ship played in the success, or lack thereof, of each voyage?
You know, imagine setting sail into the vast unknown on these ships. Now, the journey was far from smooth sailing. Think about those tense moments in the Sargasso Sea.
Right.
With the crew growing increasingly anxious.
Yeah. Columbus even adjusted his course based on the flight of migrating birds.
Wow.
Demonstrating his adaptability and keen observation skills.
It was on October 12th, 1492, that they finally made landfall.
A moment forever etched in history.
Their arrival at San Salvador in the Bahamas.
Yeah, but here's the twist.
Okay.
Columbus remained convinced he had reached the East Indies near Japan.
Oh, wow.
Which he called Cipango.
Interesting.
His initial misconception would shape his interactions with the indigenous people he encountered, as he believed he was dealing with the inhabitants of Asia.
And from this point on, the story takes a more complex turn. We're moving from exploration to colonization.
Right.
And with it, the emergence of new challenges and controversies.
Absolutely. Yeah, from this point onward, the story evolves in some pretty complicated ways. Columbus, believing he's in the Indies, starts claiming these lands for Spain.
But almost immediately, tragedy strikes the MV. Santa Maria runs aground on Christmas Day, 1492.
Yeah, and from the wreckage of the Santa Maria, they construct Fort Navidad on Hispaniola, leaving a small group of men behind. This marked the beginning of attempts at permanent European settlements in the Americas.
It's amazing to think about a wrecked ship becoming the foundation for a colony. It's a pretty powerful image. But then just a couple of years later, the story gets even more complex with the Treaty of Tordesillas.
Right. This treaty, signed in 1494 between Spain and Portugal, sought to divide newly discovered lands. By drawing a line down the Atlantic Ocean, it was essentially a blueprint for how colonization and competition would play out between those two European powers.
So as Columbus is exploring and establishing settlements, there's this whole political game unfolding back in Europe. Did this treaty impact his voyages at all?
Absolutely. It essentially restricted Columbus's exploration to the west of this line, pushing him to explore more southerly routes on his later voyages. His third voyage, for example, focused on exploring the South American mainland, driven in part by the terms of the treaty.
So on his second voyage, he returns with a much larger fleet, aiming to consolidate Spanish presence and continue exploring. This wasn't just about spices and gold anymore, was it?
No, it was about establishing dominance and control. And this shift in focus led to increased conflict with the indigenous populations. The Taino people, who had initially welcomed Columbus, started to resist Spanish attempts to exploit their labor and resources.
Before we get into that, can you tell us a bit more about the Taino people? Who were they?
The Taino were the indigenous inhabitants of much of the Caribbean. They were skilled farmers, fishermen, and artisans with a rich culture and complex social structures. Their communities were often led by chiefs or caciques, and they had a deep spiritual connection to the natural world.
So their way of life was drastically disrupted by the arrival of the Spanish share. I imagine this resistance, along with the disease outbreaks and lack of planning, created quite a bit of chaos in the colony.
It was far from the paradise. Columbus had envisioned disease, especially smallpox, devastated the indigenous population, and the colonists themselves struggled, ill-equipped for the realities of life in this new environment.
And then there's a rebellion, led by Francisco Roldan, a colonist who challenges Columbus's authority.
Roldan's rebellion exposes the discontent and deep divisions within the colony. It paints a picture of exploitation, broken promises, and mismanagement.
It seems things were spiraling out of control. How did the Spanish crown respond to this?
They sent Francisco de Bobadilla to investigate the situation. His arrival marks a turning point in Columbus's story. He discovers a colony in turmoil with accusations of cruelty and tyranny against Columbus and his brothers.
And then something unthinkable happens. Columbus is arrested and sent back to Spain in chains.
It's a dramatic fall from grace, imagine. The hero of the first voyage, the man who opened the door to the New World, now a prisoner accused of misrule. What are your thoughts on this?
It's a stark contrast to his earlier triumphs. It makes you wonder how much of his downfall was due to his own actions versus the circumstances he faced.
It's a complex question. There's no doubt that Columbus made mistakes, but he was also operating within a system that was inherently exploitative. It's important to consider the broader context of colonialism when evaluating his actions.
So even after this dramatic setback, Columbus manages to convince the monarchs to fund a fourth and final voyage.
This voyage, however, was far from a triumphant return. He was stripped of his governorship of Hispaniola, and his primary mission was now to find a westward passage to Asia, which he never achieved.
He faced constant setbacks, shipwrecks, hostile natives, even a terrifying encounter with Bobadilla's fleet during a hurricane.
It's almost poetic justice, Bobadilla, the man who arrested Columbus, now facing the same perils of the sea that Columbus had navigated for years.
And through it all, Columbus never seems to give up. He was stranded in Jamaica for a year, relying on his ingenuity and knowledge of astronomy to maintain control.
Think about that. The man who had discovered continents now struggling for survival on a small island. It's a testament to his resilience, even if his actions were often questionable.
Eventually, he's rescued and returns to Spain, a shadow of his former self, spending his final years trying to secure his legacy and the financial rewards he felt he was owed.
He died in 1506, a complex and controversial figure. His legacy continues to be debated and reevaluated centuries later.
His story is a mix of brilliance, ambition, and tragedy. It forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about exploration, colonization, and the impact of one man on the course of history. What stands out to you most about Columbus's later voyages?
I'm struck by the contrast between his initial vision and the realities he faced. He set out to find a new route to the east, fueled by dreams of wealth and glory. Instead, he stumbled into a new world, a world that would ultimately be reshaped by his arrival, but not in the way he had envisioned. It raises questions about the unforeseen consequences of our actions and the complexities of ambition.
It does make you think. We've explored the life voyages, triumphs, and controversies of this man who changed the world forever. Now it's time to take a deeper look at his lasting legacy and how we view him today.
Yeah, it's incredible how the story goes from this incredible discovery to all this turmoil and controversy. It really makes you think about how complicated history can be.
It definitely challenges our traditional ideas of heroes and villains.
Right.
Columbus's legacy is this mix of undeniable achievements.
And really incredibly difficult consequences.
On one hand, he did connect two worlds that had been completely separated for centuries. He dared to go against what everyone else thought and venture out into the unknown.
Yeah.
That takes a certain type of courage.
You're right.
Yeah.
There was incredible vision and boldness in his actions.
Right. But on the other hand, those voyages triggered a wave of colonization and exploitation that dramatically impacted the indigenous peoples of the Americas.
Right.
There's no way to ignore the dark side of his story.
Yeah.
The enslavement, the forced conversions, the destruction of entire cultures.
Absolutely.
Those are undeniable tragedies.
And it's crucial to remember that Columbus wasn't just an explorer.
Right.
He was a colonizer.
Yeah.
Driven by a thirst for wealth, power, and recognition. He saw the native people as subjects to be exploited rather than equals.
That's so evident in his writings, where he describes the indigenous people as timid and easy to control.
Yeah, it reflects a deep-seated sense of European superiority
Right.
that was prevalent at the time.
And unfortunately, that mindset paved the way for centuries of colonial oppression and the systematic erasure of indigenous cultures.
It's a difficult truth to confront.
It is, and yet even with all this,
Yeah.
Columbus remains a controversial figure to this day.
Absolutely.
Some people still hail him as a hero, a visionary who broadened the world's horizons.
And others condemn him as a brutal conqueror,
Right.
a symbol of European imperialism and its devastating impact on the Americas.
Right. It's interesting how people interpret his actions so differently.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I find fascinating is we can't neatly categorize him
Right.
as simply good or bad.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why his story continues to intrigue us centuries later.
Right. It forces us to grapple with the complexities of history.
Yeah.
And accept that even the most celebrated figures can have a dark side. And it challenges us to think critically about traditional narratives of exploration and discovery. And ask ourselves, whose voices have been left out?
Absolutely.
So thinking back on everything we've learned,
Yeah.
what surprised you the most about Columbus?
Honestly, it's the sheer audacity of his plan to set sail into the completely unknown with limited knowledge and technology,
Right.
convinced he could reach the East by sailing west. It's both awe-inspiring and unsettling.
I agree.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how differently things might have unfolded if he'd never made that journey.
It's a question historians continue to ponder.
Right.
But one thing is for sure. Columbus's story, with all its triumphs and controversies, continues to shape how we understand the past and the present.
That was a deep dive indeed.
It was.
We went through the life, the voyages, the successes, and the controversies of a man who undeniably changed the world.
Absolutely.
If you want to keep exploring, we have a list of books and articles on our website where you can delve deeper into specific aspects of Columbus's story.
And always remember, history is never a simple story.
Right.
It's a tapestry woven from many different perspectives, interpretations, and ongoing debates.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.